Welcome, sleepless spirit. I'm your storyteller tonight, here to guide you gently into the shadows of slumber, where dreams take over and worries fade away. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more bedtime tales, whispered just for you. Let me know in the comments, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it as you listen tonight? And if there's a story you've been longing to hear, something spooky, something comforting, tell me. I'm always listening. Now, tuck yourself in. Let the darkness wrap around you like a warm blanket. It's time to let go and drift into the story. One Highway 375 hitchhiker. In the summer of 1997, 3 Las Vegas college students made the decision to embark on what they hoped would be an exciting road journey across the isolated Highway 375 in Nevada, also referred to as the extraterrestrial highway. What began as an enjoyable weekend escape became the most horrific event of their lives, leaving them to reevaluate all of their preconceived notions about reality. The driver, Marcus, had taken the trip in his older brother's beaten-up Ford truck. Jake and Sarah, 2 of his buddies, were eager to explore the desert area and possibly set up camp there. They left on a Friday afternoon with enough provisions for 3 days. From Las Vegas, heading north into the Highway 375 travels 98 miles, across some of the most remote areas in the United States. Through the immense expanse of the Nevada desert, there are almost any cell phone reception, no eateries, and no gas stations. The Nevada test site, where the government tested nuclear bombs for decades, is traversed by the route. Even though Las Vegas is only a few hours' drive south, it feels like civilization is thousands of miles away. Everything went well on the first day. They stopped at the Littler, a quirky cafe that serves visitors interested in adjacent Area 51. As they drove through the small hamlet of Rachel, which has a population of 54, the pals made jokes about, while enjoying burgers and fries, conspiracies involving aliens and the government. About 20 miles north of Rachel, they discovered a good place to camp as evening drew near. They parked off the highway and pitched their tent in the desert bushes. They constructed a little bonfire that evening and spent hours gazing at the extraordinary starry sky and conversing. There was a tremendous quiet, only the rare whisper of wind through the sage scrub. No city sounds, no traffic. Around midnight, they fell asleep, feeling at ease and cut off from the outside world. Around 3 a.m., Sarah was the first to awaken, to their campsite being surrounded by the sound of footfall. She initially believed it to be an animal, possibly a desert fox or coyote. However, the footsteps were too heavy and too purposeful. They had the recognizable cadence of a boot-clad walker, slowly in a broad circle around their tent. She muttered what she was hearing and pushed Marcus awake. Marcus heard it, too, and listened intently. For almost 10 minutes, the footfall persisted, never approaching their tent, but never disappearing, always keeping the same distance. Then they stopped suddenly. For another hour, the 3 pals lay awake, listening for any noise. But the strange silence of the desert had returned. They looked for footprints or any indication of who might have been around their tent in the morning when they set up camp. It was challenging to see distinct prints on the hard-packed gravel and dirt ground. However, they discovered a number of disturbed spots in the dust that might have been footprints. About 50 yards from their tent, they discovered something more disturbing. A solitary white stone is set in the middle of a tiny pile of smooth stones that are perfectly circled. Jake wanted to get ready and get out right away, but Marcus persuaded them to spend an additional night. It was probably just a local person who was interested in their campsite, he said. Someone who lived nearby and was making sure they weren't causing problems, perhaps. He suggested that the stone circle was most likely really a coincidence, perhaps a remnant of past campers, or an ancient Native American marking. On the second day, they hiked through the desert, took pictures, and explored the surroundings. They went back to their campground as darkness drew near and got ready for another night of stargazing. This time, they decided to alternate between remaining awake and keeping watch in case their enigmatic guest came again. At 10 p.m., Sarah took the first watch. Up until 1 a.m., nothing took place. Jake took over at 1 in the morning, until 4 a.m., and he said there was nothing out of the ordinary. Around 4:30 a.m., Marcus was meant to take the last watch till daybreak. The sound of their truck's engine starting roused the three of them. When they clambered from their tent, they saw that their pickup truck's headlights were blazing in the dark. The engine was running, but the driver was alone. Marcus had entered the tent with the keys. They were still in his pocket when he checked it. After running to the truck and shutting off the engine, Jake attempted to restart it with Marcus's keys, but was unsuccessful. The engine had died entirely. They heard the footsteps again as they stood near the truck, attempting to understand what had happened, but they weren't walking around the campsite this time. The footsteps were approaching them straight through the desert from the highway's direction. Within the beam of using their flashlights, they were able to make out a tall, slender man who was carrying something in his hand and appeared to be dressed in vintage attire. "Hello, can you help us? Our truck won't start." The three friends gathered by their truck and called out to the man approaching, but he didn't answer. He simply continued to approach them at the same slow, methodical speed they had heard the previous evening. They saw more details as he approached, which chilled them to the bone. The man was dressed in what appeared to be 1950s fashion: suspenders, a white shirt, and high-waisted pants. He had a pale, emaciated face. The flashlight beam was virtually grey. The most unsettling thing was that he seemed to be holding a can of gasoline. He halted his movement and simply remained there, gazing at the figure until it was around 30 feet distant, for what seemed like several minutes. No one spoke or moved. The man abruptly turned around and started to walk back toward the freeway. The buddies, still holding the gas can, dared not move until they could no longer see him in the darkness. They hurriedly dismantled their tent, loaded everything into the truck's rear, and attempted to start the engine once more. It turned over instantly this time. Like though nothing had ever been, there's something wrong with it. They only made one gas stop in the town of Alamo on their way back to Las Vegas. They didn't start talking about what had happened or researching Highway 375 until they were securely back in the city. Their encounter was rendered much more terrifying by what they learned. A guy by the name of Robert Morrison had vanished in 1955 while traveling on what is now Highway 375. Morrison was never seen again, but his automobile was discovered abandoned on the side of the road. Newspaper accounts from the time state that Morrison was concerned about running out of fuel in the isolated desert region, so he had been keeping extra gasoline in his automobile. The stories they discovered from other drivers who had encountered identical situations along the same highway were even more unsettling. Numerous witnesses had over the years described seeing a tall, slender man dressed in 1950s attire wandering down Highway 375, always carrying a gas can, and consistently showing up at night close to campgrounds or abandoned cars. The three companions hardly discussed their encounter with anybody else, and they never went back to Highway 375. However, Marcus still has the photos they shot on the trip, including one they missed until the film was developed. You can plainly see a tall, slender guy standing among the sagebrush approximately 100 yards distant, watching them, in the background of a photo of their campsite on the second day. Officially, experiences like theirs are explained by the fact that the harshness and solitude of the Nevada desert can cause hallucinations and false recollections. However, Sarah, Jake, and Marcus are aware that what they went through was genuine. They are aware that their truck started on its own using the keys in Marcus' pocket, and they know that someone or something was strolling around their tents during those 2 nights. One of America's most isolated and barren highways is still Highway 375. Before attempting to drive through the region, travelers are advised to notify someone of their intended route and to bring additional food, water, and fuel. The most crucial piece of advice, though, could be to stay away from camping overnight by the highway, particularly if you spot the tall, slender man who still roams the desert with his gas can in search of something he lost more than 60 years ago. Long time ago, to the screaming forest of Route 2A in October 2003, to Boston friends David Chen and Mike Sullivan made the decision to drive the Mohawk Trail in western Massachusetts in the fall foliage. A tranquil weekend trip through some of the most breathtaking autumnal landscapes in New England turned into a nightmare that neither man has ever experienced, able to completely clarify or forget. For roughly 63 miles, the Mohawk Trail, officially known as Route 2A, winds through the Berkshire Mountains, passing through thick forests that have remained largely unaltered for centuries. During the height of the foliage season, when millions of maple, oak, and birch trees turn the landscape into a breathtaking display of color, it is regarded as one of New England's most picturesque drives. Oranges, golds, and reds. Mike believed the vacation would help his friend, David, who had recently gone through a painful divorce, get his mind straight. They intended to go leisurely down Route 2A, making stops at picturesque vistas and tiny mountain villages. They might even spend the night at a bed and breakfast along the way. Although neither man was an avid outdoor enthusiast, they both enjoyed the splendor of the rural New England landscape. On a Friday afternoon in the middle of October, they set out in Mike's Honda Accord, heading west from Boston. With Tong in the low 60s, the weather was ideal, clear and crisp. The forest was at its most colorful as they approached Greenfield on the Mohawk Trail, and both men were struck by the breathtaking vistas that surround each bend in the road. They made the decision to stop at a picturesque overlook to take pictures around 20 meters into the trail, close to the village of Charlemont. From the overlook, a broad perspective of the Deerfield River Valley could be seen, with hills blanketed in vibrant fall foliage extending to the horizon. They took photos for almost half an hour and savoring the view before resuming their journey in the vehicle. The forest appeared to enclose them as they continued to drive into the highlands. As the trees became denser and taller, a canopy formed above them, filtering the afternoon sun into patterns that danced on the road. Although everything was lovely, there was also a little disturbing how alone they had gotten. Miles had passed since they had seen another vehicle, and the road was surrounded by an interminable forest with no houses or businesses in sight. 4:00 p.m. they heard something while traveling through an especially thick wooded area close to the Hussock Range. Both of them froze at that. Neither man had ever heard a sound like that before. Something seemed like it was coming from deep in the forest, a high-pitched, piercing scream. For roughly 10 seconds, the scream sounded like someone or something in excruciating pain, rising and decreasing in pitch. Mike stopped right away and switched off the engine. They listened in stillness, but all they could hear were the typical woodland noises, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, the wind in the trees, and the occasional bird call. A few minutes later, Mike said it could have been a hawk or another predatory bird. They chose to keep driving despite David's skepticism. They heard it again less than a mile later. The scream was considerably louder this time, and it sounded as though it was coming from several different locations at once, as though several creatures were calling to one another through the woods. Both men were chilled by the sound. Backbones. They couldn't distinguish any animal's cries. It had an almost human quality, yet it was so twisted and incorrect that it made their skin crawl. When Mike stopped again, David got out of the car to pay closer attention. The woodland had collapsed. Utterly quiet. No insects, no birds, no wind. It was so quiet that it seemed suffocating, as if the whole forest was holding its breath. Then a single, long scream that seemed to stretch on forever came from somewhere far to their left in the trees. Mike instantly turned on the engine as David leapt back into the vehicle. They sped along the twisting mountain road as fast as they could. What they had heard left both guys deeply shocked. The following few miles were filled with sporadic shouting, occasionally from one side of the road, occasionally from the opposite direction, and occasionally appearing to originate straight above in the tree canopy. The shrieking eventually subsided as they got closer to North Adams, and they started to notice traces of civilization once more, power lines, houses, and other vehicles on the road. While filling up at a petrol station, they inquired of the attendant whether he had ever the old man at the register listened to the strange noises coming from the forest along Route 2A for a long, serious moment before responding. "Didn't you guys drive via the Hussock region?" When they nodded, he said. "You're not the first person to come in here and inquire about screaming in those woods," he added. "Been taking place 4 years, or perhaps decades. The reason is unknown. Locals had different theories about the screams," he informed them. Some believed the odd acoustic phenomena were just the result of wind flowing across mountain rock formations. Others thought it was the fisher cats, a kind of big weasel that is notorious for its horrifying shrieking noises, make mating calls. However, the gas station attendant had heard fisher cats numerous times over his lifetime in the region. It was different from what folks said they heard in the Hoosick forest. Those forests were the subject of my grandfather's stories. According to the elderly man, he asserted that there were non-natural creatures residing there, items that had existed before the arrival of the first settlers. The original inhabitants of this valley, the Mohawk Indians, also had tales to tell. They avoided that area of the forest whenever they could because they referred to it as the place where spirits cry. That same evening, David and Mike made the decision to end their journey early and return to Boston by car. Nowhere close to those woods did they wish to spend the night. However, the yailing resumed as they headed east on Route 2, retracing their route via the Hussock Range. It was worse this time. The cries appeared to keep up with them, following their vehicle. Regardless of Mike's speed, the noises were no longer far away. As though something were running parallel to the road through the forest, they appeared to be coming from just beyond the tree line, keeping up with their car while yailing in that awful, inhuman voice. Once, David was positive that he caught a glimpse of something moving through the trees. A shadowy figure, too big to be a human, moved with an unsettling, nearly human gait. The black gaps between the tree trunks were all that was visible when he turned to face it. When they had to slow down for a sharp turn, it was the worst. On the road, the screaming seemed to get closer and closer as their pace dropped, until it sounded as though it was directly outside their windows. Mike depressed the accelerator, causing the Honda to accelerate beyond its safe speed along the mountain route. At that time, however, neither man gave a damn about speed limits. They continued driving until they were well away from the Mohawk Trail. At the Massachusetts Turnpike, it wasn't until the screaming eventually stopped that they were able to hear the typical noises of civilization and highway traffic. Upon returning to Boston, both guys made an effort to learn more about their experiences. They discovered a lot of reports in the local newspaper and online forums. Records of individuals reporting hearing inexplicable yailing in the woods along Route 2A, especially in the vicinity of the Hussock Range. Similar stories from hikers, campers, and drivers who had heard the enigmatic noises date back decades. Their own experience was not as unsettling as some of the tales. A family went camping in 1987 in the shrieking, which occasionally appeared to be from right above their tent, had persisted all night, according to the state forest close to the path. To hikers reported seeing dark figures moving through the trees during the screaming in 1995. Whenever they attempted to look directly at them, the figures appeared to vanish. The most disturbing finding was a report from 1978 concerning a lone hiker who vanished in the Hussock Forest after informing companions that he intended to look into the origin of yailing noises he had heard during earlier visits to the region. State police and volunteer rescue teams searched extensively, but they were never able to locate his body. Neither Mike nor David ever went back to Western Massachusetts, nor did they ever go on another road trip together. A few years later, David relocated to California, in part, he acknowledges, to avoid being as close to those yailing forests as possible. Even though Mike still resides in Boston, he won't drive close to the Mohawk Trail. State wildlife officials have officially said that the screaming is most likely the result of fisher cats, which are renowned for creating loud, obtrusive noises when mating season arrives. The calls of fisher cats, albeit disturbing, do not correspond with the descriptions provided by witnesses of the screaming in the Hussock woodland, because they are solitary creatures that do not vocalize in groups. The screams are still being heard by locals, especially in the fall when more tourists are expected to be passing through the area. State police and park rangers report receiving reports concerning the noises on occasion, but investigations are never conducted. Any proof of the possible cause of them. Every year, hundreds of tourists safely traverse the Mohawk Trail, en route to a continues to be a well-liked picturesque trip. However, the experience is unforgettable for those who have heard the yailing. In the Hussock Forest, something is hiding in those old forests and doesn't want to be discovered. Additionally, it announces its existence in the most horrifying manner imaginable, through screams of agony that appeared to be from a different planet. 3. The Blackout Highway. Jenny Martinez was traveling alone on Interstate 10 from Phoenix to Los Angeles in August 2005. Beginning her senior year at UCLA, the trip should have taken about 6 hours. What transpired during an apparently harmless trip across Arizona's Sonoran Desert turned into the most horrific night of her life. And she would be terrified to travel alone after dark for years to come. Jenny had driven from Phoenix to Los Angeles numerous times, typically choosing the straight route via Interstate 10, which passed through the arid villages of Quartzsite and Blythe. Her GPS, however, recommended a different route along State Route 72, a less traveled highway that would only add roughly 30 minutes to her trip, while avoiding the traffic, as construction delays near Tonopah had caused traffic to back up for miles on this particular evening. Route 72 winds through some of Arizona's most isolated desert, traversing large tracts of untouched territory where the only indications of human existence are the sporadic deserted gas station and dilapidated wayside eatery. On this type of route, you can go for an hour without seeing another car because all you can see are vast stretches of rock, sand, and sporadic desert plants. About 6 p.m., Jenny departed Phoenix, intending to get in Los Angeles prior to midnight. She would not reach Route 72 until after 8 p.m. due to the construction diversion. But she believed she could manage driving in the dark over the desert. She had a trustworthy Honda Civic, her cell phone was fully charged, and her gas tank was full. What might go wrong? Jenny saw how quickly the countryside turned bleak when she drove into Route 72, just as the sun was sinking. In a matter of minutes, she had abandoned that they entered a world of total isolation, surrounded by the I-10 corridor's dispersed suburbs and truck stops. She could see no other lights in either direction, as the highway stretched in front of her like a black ribbon, lit just by her headlights. After driving down Route 72 for about 45 minutes, Jenny observed an odd object in her rearview mirror. She could see a car following her, but the headlights were strangely bright and tinted bluish, unlike any she had ever seen in an automobile. Observed, even when she decelerated or accelerated to see if the car was truly following her. It never came closer to her, but never fell back. Jenny was initially relieved to see another vehicle on the desolate desert road. However, as the minutes went by, she started to feel uneasy about the unusual blue lights that were always there in her mirror. She attempted to accelerate to 80 miles per hour, but the light behind her remained at the same distance. She reduced her speed to 55 miles per hour. Once more, the enigmatic car precisely matched her speed. This continued for around 20 minutes before Jenny made the decision to stop whenever she could to give the other car space. She turned on her turn signal when she noticed a tiny dirt pull-out space up ahead. However, when she started to slow down, something occurred that chilled her to the bone. Abruptly, the blue lights behind her went out, as though the other car had just disappeared into the night. Jenny paused at the pull-out and waited for a few minutes while the engine ran, and she kept an eye on her mirrors for any indication of the enigmatic vehicle. Behind her, however, the desert highway was silent and pitch black. Nothing, no engine noise, no headlights. The other car seemed to have never been there. Jenny, rattled to her core, turned back onto Route 72 and headed toward Los Angeles. Her sense that something really odd had just happened persisted even after she made an effort to convince herself that the other motorist had just turned off onto a side road she hadn't noticed. The electrical system in her car started to malfunction around 10 miles down the highway. Her radio began to cycle among stations on its own, picking up bits and pieces of country music, Spanish-language broadcasts, and what sounded like 1940s-era radio programs. Her speedometer needle started bouncing erratically between readings, and her dashboard lights flickered on and off. Then, suddenly, everything was black. Her dashboard and headlights, the car's radio, lights, and other electrical components just turned off, while the engine kept going. At 65 mph, Jenny was driving blind across the dark desert. She instantly depressed the pedal and started braking, slowly in an attempt to slow down without losing control of the vehicle, because she couldn't see the road in front of her or behind her. It was completely dark. There are no lights on the horizon, no moon, and no stars to be seen. It was the most complete and scary darkness she had ever encountered. She was on what she hoped was still the interstate when she finally got the automobile to stop. Her electrical system restarted. She reactivated her headlights. Her radio started up again, and her dashboard sprang to life, but she screamed when she saw what was in the beam of her headlights. She was off the roadway now. The automobile sat in the center of what looked like a deserted town. A dusty main thoroughfare was flanked by empty buildings. Like lifeless eyes, their shattered windows gazed at her. An old Western movie's ghost town scenario was complete with rusting petrol pumps, dilapidated buildings with faded signage, and what appeared to be a cafe from the 1950s. Jenny's immediate reaction was to retreat and leave the area as soon as she could. She was horrified by what she saw when she slammed the car into reverse and glanced in her rearview mirror. A crowd of people stood in the street behind her car, lit by her red tail lights. They were dressed in vintage attire. She couldn't quite make out their faces in the faint light, but the women in long dresses and the guys in suits and fedoras were all looking straight at her automobile. In the hopes of finding a way back to the highway, she put the car back in gear and started to carefully make her way through the abandoned town. She drove by the individuals in the street, but they did not move or respond. With those unreadable, immovable stares, they simply stood there observing her. She became increasingly uneasy as she drove farther into the town and saw more details. Despite the building's apparent decades-long abandonment, there were no indications of weather-related degradation or disintegration that one might anticipate in the desert. As though the entire town had been preserved just as it was on the day everyone left, everything appeared to have been frozen in time. Jenny discovered what looked to be a road heading out of town at the far end of the main street. Desperate to return to Route 72, she followed it, speeding as quickly as she could on the dirt road. She drove across more desolate desert for approximately 5 minutes before coming to a stop on a tiny hill and seeing something that almost caused her to lose control of the vehicle. She had returned to the roadway, but not to the place she had anticipated. She was 150 miles west of where she had been when her electrical system failed, which should have taken her more than 2 hours to drive, according to her GPS. However, the clock on her automobile had only been running for around 20 minutes. Jenny continued to drive till she arrived to the Los Angeles suburbs. She attempted to report what had happened at the closest police station right away, but the responding cops didn't appear to believe her. They speculated that she might have dozed off while driving and dreamt the whole thing. Jenny, however, is aware that she wasn't dreaming. When she looked up information about deserted communities along Route 72 online the following morning, she shot pictures with her phone. She discovered old documents of Esperanza, a mining community that had been abandoned when the copper mine closed in the 1960s. She had seen exactly the same pictures of Esperanza from the 1950s, when the town was at its best. The same diner, the same gas pump, the same stores. Her discovery of a 1962 newspaper story on the town's last days was the most unsettling. The story claims that residents of Esperanza observed weird electrical disruptions the night before the town was formally abandoned. Radios and car lights went off, and a number of people reported seeing enigmatic blue lights traveling through the desert beyond the town. Jenny looked for Esperanza's location on contemporary maps, but neither a GPS device nor an atlas now in use show it. Satellite photos show that the region where the town should be is a barren desert with no roads or buildings. The entire location seems to have vanished from the world. She has never told her family the whole story of what happened that night, and she never drove Route 72 again. But occasionally, when she's driving alone after dark, she obsessively checks her rearview mirror out of fear that she might see those weird blue lights pursuing her once more. Similar encounters along isolated desert roadways in Arizona and Nevada have been reported by other drivers. On truck stop bulletin boards and online forums, people share stories of electrical outages, wasted time, and experiences with places that shouldn't be there. Highway enforcement officials in the area are aware of these incidents, but they typically blame them on simple navigation errors, driver fatigue, or optical illusions brought on by the heat of the desert. However, for those who have personally witnessed it, there is no question that something inexplicable exists amid the American Southwest's immense emptiness. Something that has the ability to beckon unsuspecting tourists into locations that exist outside of time and space by reaching out from the shadows. Locations where the desert never forgets its secrets and the past refuses to be buried. The Sonoran Desert is still traversed by Route 72, which hundreds of cars utilize each year without any problems. However, some visitors claim seeing unusual blue lights in their mirrors and having electrical issues that defy explanations late at night, when the desert is at its most remote and desolate. And some, like Jenny Martinez, end up going to locations that aren't actually there, encountering individuals who ought to have been gone for decades and coming back to the contemporary world with unanswerable questions. For the Mirror Lake incident, in September 2001, brothers Tom and Alex Brennan made the decision to camp for the weekend at Mirror Lake in the northeastern Utah Winter Mountains. What began as a straightforward moment of sibling bonding evolved into a terrible ordeal that would strain their relationship and leave both men with scars unrelated to the actual wilderness. The 28-year-old older brother, Tom, was having a hard time readjusting to civilian life after returning from a deployment abroad. Alex, a 24-year-old recent college graduate, believed his brother could unwind with a peaceful weekend in the mountains. When they were kids, they had gone to Mirror Lake with their father, which was a well-liked spot, an immaculate mountain lake accessible via a meandering mountain route that rose about 10,000 feet above sea level. It was encircled by thick pine forests, with enough food for 3 days, fishing gear, and camping supplies. They departed Salt Lake City early on Saturday. Morning in Tom's Ford Explorer. State Route 150, often known as the Mirror Lake Highway, is a picturesque 42-mile route that passes through some of Utah's most breathtaking scenery, wilderness. In contrast to the dark green of the pine forests, the aspen trees' dazzling gold hues in the fall provide a breathtaking sight. From the valley, the drive up to Mirror Lake takes roughly 2 hours. As the route rises in elevation, it gradually passes through a number of biological zones. Tom and Alex traveled quickly, making just one stop at a tiny mountain shop near course to purchase more groceries and ice. The weather was great at higher elevations. It was clear and cool, with lows in the 60s. Around noon, they arrived at Mirror Lake and located a good campground tucked away in the trees, a quarter of a mile from the main camping area, where they would have more privacy. The name of the lake was accurate. It appeared as though one was peering into a different planet beneath the surface, since the water was so calm and pure that it perfectly reflected the nearby peaks and forest. The brothers set up their tents and camp chairs, and then went fishing, and spoke for the afternoon. It was the initial since Tom's return from his trip abroad. They had had genuine conversations, and Alex was glad to see that his brother appeared more at ease than he had in months. Enjoying the quiet seclusion of the mountain wilderness, they prepared their dinner and made a bonfire as darkness drew near. Approximately 10 p.m., when they were getting ready to submit for the both brothers froze when they heard something in the middle of the night. It came from the direction of the lake and was the sound of kids laughing. The laughter was joyful and high-pitched, like the sound you might hear in the summer at a playground or swimming pool. Mirror Lake, however, was empty. They hadn't observed another individual throughout the day, and the water was excessively chilly for swimming. Using their torches, Tom and Alex strolled down to the shore to look around. The lake was motionless, its surface reflecting the stars above like black glass. There were no boats, no other illuminated campsites, no indications of other people nearby, and no other explanation for what they had heard. They searched for a few minutes before heading back to their campground, blaming the alpine environment for some sort of sonic trick. However, they heard it once more an hour later, right before they went to sleep. The laughs this time seemed to originate from just beyond their tent. In addition to the children's laughter, they could now hear water splashing, as though other youngsters were playing in the lake in spite of the total darkness and frigid temperatures. After unzipping the tent flap, Alex looked out. His breath caught in his throat at what he witnessed. Previously completely still, the lake was suddenly encrusted with tiny waves and ripples, as though something big was in motion underneath the surface. There was nothing obvious that might be generating the disturbance, but he could see the water boiling and churning in several places in the beam of his flashlight. For about 20 minutes, the laughter persisted, occasionally emanating from the lake's surrounding woodland and other times from the water itself. Then, suddenly, there was silence. The brothers heard nothing but the typical midnight noises of the forest, the whisper of wind through the pines, and the distant call of an owl, as the lake reverted to its mirror-like calm. That night, neither man slept well. Tom was listening to every sound, on the lookout for any indication of danger, having become hyper-vigilant during his military service. Alex wondered as he lay awake whether they were having a shared hallucination brought on by stress or the high altitude. The events of the previous night looked less dangerous in the wide daylight as Sunday morning broke clear and lovely. For their scheduled second night, the brothers chose to stay. Whatever they had heard, they reasoned, was probably simply a strange natural event. About half a mile from their campground, they hiked around the lake and explored the surrounding forest, finding nothing out of the ordinary but for what looked like ancient stone foundations tucked away in the trees. The foundations were half buried beneath decades worth of fallen leaves, moss covered and hardly discernible. However, the outline of a number of small structures, grouped in a rough circle around what may have been a central courtyard or gathering place, was clearly visible. The ruins of what appeared to be a well were discovered by Alex. They were now covered in mud and trash. That evening, when they got back to their tent, Tom used a satellite internet connection to conduct some research. On his laptop, he discovered something that severely unsettled both brothers. Historical documents indicate that in the 1940s and early 1950s, a children's summer camp had been located near Mirror Lake. For about 10 years, Camp Wapiti has been providing high country wilderness experiences to children from Salt Lake City and other Utah cities. Following what newspaper accounts portrayed as a horrific tragedy involving several victims, the camp had been shuttered in 1953. There were no specifics, but it seemed that a number of kids had perished in a swimming accident at night. The precise according to various stories. The number of victims fluctuated, but everyone agreed that it was the biggest catastrophe in Utah's camping history. What Tom discovered in a digital collection of local newspaper clippings was even more unsettling. A 1954 article said that when the victims' families went to the lake to remember their children, they had seen odd things. Numerous parents reported hearing their departed children's laughter and voices emanating from the sea, especially after dark. Both brothers were reconsidering staying at Mirror Lake for another night as Sunday night drew near. However, they had already driven the entire distance up the mountain, and in the broad afternoon sunlight, it seemed absurd to shorten their journey due to some old tales. Although they agreed to stay, they take turns remaining awake to maintain watch over their bonfire, which burns all night. The first watch was taken by Alex at 1000 p.m. until 2 in the morning. It was peaceful and usual for the first few hours. The lake stayed motionless, reflecting their campfire's light and the sky. However, at 1:30 a.m. he started to hear something that gave him the chills. Children singing, a faint sound. The song was a camp tune. It's the type of straightforward, repetitive song that children may sing while trekking a route or over a campfire. The voices seemed to originate from the other side of the sea. They were thin and far away, however. Some of the words were visible to Alex. The valley is very low down there. Raise your head. Listen to the breeze. For roughly 15 minutes, the singing persisted, constantly remaining just above the range of hearing, as though the voices were attempting to convey something, but were unable to do so from their current location. Tom was awakened for his watch shift by Alex. However, the singing had ceased by the time his sibling was completely awake. Tom starts his watch shift at 2 a.m. until 6 in the morning. Turned out to be far worse. Around 4 a.m. he started to notice lights moving beneath the lake surface. Underwater lanterns flickered back and forth in pale bluish hues. The sound of children's voices complemented the lights. However, this time, they weren't singing or laughing. They were phoning for assistance. The voices seemed to be saying, "Help us, please assist us in getting out of the water. We are so chilly that we are unable to do so." Tom subsequently characterized the encounter as the most heartbreaking thing he had ever heard. Even though he understood logically that no living children could survive in the icy mountain water, his impulse was to rush into the lake and attempt to save whoever was asking for assistance. The whispers were so frantic and realistic that he had to use all of his strength to stick to the campfire as an alternative to plunging into the lake, until the first rays of sunshine hit the water surface just before dawn. The calling persisted. The voices ceased and the underwater lights vanished as soon as the sun came up, returning the lake to its regular, peaceful state. The brothers dismantled their tents, while swiftly as they could, and returned to Salt Lake City by car without discussing their ordeal. They didn't talk about the weekend until a few days later, and both guys were shocked to learn that they had heard the same voices speaking the same words. Tom never again went camping. He was extremely anxious about going in isolated places as a result of the Mirror Lake incident and the trauma he had already experienced during his military duty. Eventually, he relocated to a big city where he felt safer because of the people and activities there. About 5 years later, Alex went back to Mirror Lake in the hopes of persuading himself that the entire experience had been a collective hallucination. During the day, he went by himself and explored the region for several hours, strolling about the lake. More traces of the former summer camp were discovered by him, along with rusted equipment, pieces of old signs, and what looked to be a memorial plaque that had been erected close to the shoreline, but was too worn to read well. However, Alex started to hear the sound of youngsters laughing across the water as nightfall drew near and the temperature started to drop. He packed up his day gear and headed back to his. He was so eager to leave Mirror Lake that he drove the automobile as fast as he could down the mountain road quicker than was safe. Reports of strange sounds and sightings at Mirror Lake are not new to local park rangers and Forest Service staff, but they typically dismiss them as the result of wildlife, acoustic effects brought on by the mountain environment, or the overactive imaginations of campers who have heard the old stories about the summer camp tragedy. The lake is still a well-liked location for a hiking, fishing, and camping. Additionally, many of individuals come each year without encountering any odd circumstances. However, Mirror Lake will always be a location of mystery and melancholy for those who have heard the voices of the kids who never left the lake. In the clear daytime, the ocean may appear serene and welcoming, but the lake remembers what transpired there over 70 years ago when night falls and the temperature drops, and the kids who perished in its frigid depths still scream for someone to guide them back home. 5. The Fog Highway. In November 2004, Lisa and Mark Peterson, who were married, were returning to Portland after spending the weekend in Eureka, California, visiting Lisa's parents. They had traveled Highway 101, a picturesque road, dozens of times before, coastal route that travels through the tall redwood woods of Northern California. What ought to have been a routine 5-hour drive turned into a horrific ordeal that left them both doubting their sanity and terrified to drive that section of highway ever again. It was about 3:00 p.m. when the couple left Eureka, in the hopes of being in Portland before nightfall on a Sunday afternoon, with its old redwood groves and sporadic views of the Pacific Ocean through forest breaches. Highway 101 across Northern California is renowned for its breathtaking landscape. However, it is also infamous for abrupt weather shifts, especially dense fog that can unexpectedly blow in from the ocean and cut visibility to a few feet. Lisa was sleeping in the passenger seat of their Toyota Camry, which Mark was operating. The first hour of the journey had gone smoothly, and they had passed through the tiny logging villages of Klamath and Orick without any problems. There was no sign of the impending nightmare in the clear, but cloudy weather. Approximately 4:30 p.m. when they were behind the wheel, about 30 miles south of Crescent City, Mark saw fog start to develop in the distance ahead as they passed through a particularly dense area of redwood forest. Initially, it seemed to be merely a faint fog hanging to the treetops, but in a matter of minutes, the fog had significantly deepened and was spreading like a grey wall across the highway. As they moved into the fog bank, Mark reduced his speed from 55 piri to about zero visibility. For a Highway 101, this was not out of the ordinary. Experienced drivers knew to just slow down and utilize their headlights until they passed through coastal fog, which was a typical problem. This fog, however, was unique. It was so uniformly thick that it appeared to absorb Mark's headlights, leaving almost no light visible past the front bumper of their vehicle. The fog seemed to drown out all sound, which was even more unsettling. The typical noises of the forest were vanished, and he could hardly hear the engine of their own vehicle. Lisa woke up as they entered the fog and immediately realized something was amiss. How long has this been going on? Gazing out at the intimidating grey wall enclosing their car, she asked. "Just a few minutes," Mark said, tightening his hold on the steering wheel as he attempted to follow the highway's yellow center line. It should clear up soon. But 20 minutes later, Mark had been forced to slow down even more. They continued to drive in the same thick fog that showed no signs of clearing. Since entering the fog bank, they had not seen a single car, road sign, or other landmark, and the utter quiet outside their vehicle just added to the eerie atmosphere as they crawled along at around 15 Martirini, keeping as near to the center line as possible. After 10 more minutes of driving blind through the fog, Lisa suggested they pull over and wait for conditions to improve. Normally, Highway 101 was a constant stream of traffic, especially on Sunday afternoons, but they heard no other engines, no trucks, and no sounds of civilization at all. It was as though they had entered a world where they were the only living things. Mark stopped the car in what he hoped was still the travel lane and activated the hazard lights. But when he looked for the shoulder of the road, he found something that made them both shiver. There didn't seem to be a shoulder anymore, and the white lines that marked the highway's edges had completely vanished, while the yellow center line continued straight ahead. After about 15 minutes, Lisa tried to call for help on her cell phone, but there was no signal at all, not even the no service message, just a blank screen, as if the phone couldn't detect any cellular towers in the area. They sat in silence, listening to the tick-tick-tick of the emergency flashers, surrounded by the grey void of the fog. As they waited, they both started to notice. Lisa was the first to notice the shapes, and at first she thought her eyes were playing tricks. The fog outside their windows was not just thick, but it seemed to be moving in patterns that didn't fit any natural weather phenomenon. Rather than drifting randomly with air currents, the fog seemed to be swirling and flowing in deliberate, almost intelligent ways, like smoke following invisible channels in the air. The uniform grayness tricked her, but slowly she started to notice what appeared to be human beings moving through the fog around their automobile. The figures were tall and thin, walking upright, but their movements were jerky and weird, not quite real. "Mark, do you see that?" she muttered. There were undoubtedly figures moving in the fog, not just one or two, but hundreds of them traveling in all directions around their stationary car, some of them seeming to be strolling along what should have been the side window. Mark looked where she was pointing and felt his blood run cold. Mark decided to resume driving, hoping to escape whatever was moving around them in the fog, while others appeared to be moving through the forest, or maybe what was once the forest. The figures never got close enough to see clearly, always staying just at the edge of visibility in the grey murk, but their movements were deeply unsettling, too fluid in some ways, too jerky in others, as if they were trying to mimic human locomotion, but not quite getting it right. However, as soon as he shifted the car into drive and started to move, the figures appeared to respond to his movements. Rather than continuing their haphazard meandering, the shapes started to follow the car's path, following along as Mark gradually accelerated. For the next hour, Lisa and Mark drove through the fog with their odd escorts. No matter how quickly or slowly they moved, the figures stayed in their positions around the car, occasionally coming into view, sometimes vanishing completely, but always coming back. The silence was unbroken, no footsteps, no engines, no voices, just the muffled sound of their own cars struggling through the dense air. The scariest part was when one of the figures got closer than any before to the driver's side of the car, and Mark could see it walking beside his window, perfectly in sync with their 20 miles per hour speed. The figure looked like it was dressed in some sort of vintage attire, perhaps a dress or long coat, but its movements were all wrong. Mark was too scared to look at the figure directly, but he could see it turning its head toward the car as if trying to look inside, and it walked without any up and down motion, as if it were gliding just above the ground, with its arms hanging motionless at its sides, even as it moved. Lisa grabbed his arm and murmured, "Don't look at it. Continue driving." The fog started to clear. There were what seemed like hours, but was really only about 90 minutes, and Mark could once more see the forms of trees. Gradually, the grey nothingness gave way to the familiar Highway 101 landscape, and as visibility increased, the figures in the fog grew less distinct and eventually vanished completely. And when they eventually emerged from the fog bank, Lisa and Mark were surprised to find that they were now about 60 miles south of where they had entered the fog, which should have taken at least an hour and a half to drive. But they had only spent about 2 hours in the fog. The clock on their dashboard indicated it was now past 7:00 p.m, and they had been travelling at very slow speeds for the majority of that time. What's more confusing is that, despite having the engine running the entire time, their gas gauge indicated they had used virtually little fuel throughout their time in the fog. They drove the rest of the way to Portland in startled quiet, but Mark was positive they had entered the fog around 4:30 p.m, meaning they had wasted almost an hour somewhere in that grey vacuum. Both trying to process what they had experienced, when they finally arrived home, they immediately went online to research fog conditions along Highway 101, hoping to find some rational explanation for what had happened. What they found was deeply disturbing. Over the years, dozens of drivers had reported similar drivers reported losing hours of time while travelling through these fog banks, emerging miles from where they expected to be with no memory of how they got there. Other experiences along that stretch of Highway 101 included thick fog that appeared suddenly and lasted far longer than usual, complete radio and cell phone blackouts, and sightings of mysterious figures moving through the mist. The bus was found 3 days later, completely empty, about 40 miles south of its last known position. The most disturbing discovery was a set of reports from the 1970s regarding a bus accident that had happened during a severe fog event on Highway 101. The bus, which was carrying 30 passengers, had vanished during a dense fog bank near the same area where Lisa and Mark had their experience. Police reports state that the abandoned bus was found with the engine running, the passengers' belongings still in their seats. No signs of violence or struggle, and no evidence of what had happened to the people inside. Despite intensive search efforts, the driver and passengers were never located. Lisa and Mark never drove Highway 101 through that area of Northern California again. Instead, they took a longer inland route that added several hours to their trip. When they needed to visit Lisa's parents, the case was still officially unsolved, but some investigators speculated that the passengers had become lost in the fog and wandered into the forest, where they became lost and died of exposure. But sometimes, on foggy nights in Portland, Lisa would wake up and glance out their bedroom window, fearing that she might see those same tall, strange figures moving through the mist in their neighborhood. They also never discussed their experience with friends or family, knowing that they would be assumed to be lying or suffering from some sort of shared delusion. Highway 101 remains one of California's most heavily traveled roads, and most drivers who encounter fog along the coastal sections experience nothing more than reduced visibility and slower travel times. Weather services regularly issue fog advisories for the area, warning drivers to use caution and reduce speeds when visibility is limited. However, Mark would find himself obsessively checking weather reports before any road trip, refusing to travel if there was even a slight chance of fog. Keep coming in. Drivers who emerge from the fog miles away from their intended destination, travelers who lose time in fog banks that seem to last longer than they should, and sporadic sightings of figures moving through the fog in ways that don't seem quite human. The official explanation is typically driver disorientation, brought on by those who have been there. There is no question that something strange occurs in those fog banks along Highway 101, something that exists in the gap between the visible world and whatever is beyond it. Despite the uniform visual environment of dense fog and the psychological strain of driving in conditions of almost zero visibility, you never feel safe driving through fog again, no matter where you are. After you've seen those figures moving through the fog experienced that strange silence, and lost time in the grey void. 60 endless rest stop, something that uses the cover of the mist to reach into our reality and touch the lives of unsuspecting travelers. When Rachel Davis, then a 23-year-old college student, drove alone from Denver to Kansas City in March 2006 to attend her grandmother's funeral. The 11-hour drive along Interstate 70 should have been routine, a straight shot east across the Colorado plains and into Kansas, but what transpired at a seemingly routine rest stop in the middle of nowhere would turn her trip into a waking nightmare that she still finds difficult to fully comprehend or forget. Having driven her dependable Honda Accord on the route multiple times, Rachel had left Denver at around 6 a.m. with the goal of arriving in Kansas City by evening. Interstate 70, which runs through eastern Colorado and western Kansas, is one of the most boring highways in the United States. Only sporadic grain elevators and little rural settlements punctuated the endless flat grassland. By 2:00 p.m., she had driven 8 hours and was in the center of Kansas, still roughly 3 hours from Kansas City. The scenery outside her windows was hypnotically repetitive, miles of brown wheat stubble stretching to the horizon under a grey March sky. She made the decision to seek out a rest stop so she could stretch her legs and get a coffee, because she was growing tired of the routine. And after about 20 minutes, she noticed a sign indicating a facility to meters ahead. The rest stop looked fairly new, a single-story brick building with large windows, surrounded by a parking lot that could accommodate maybe 30 cars, and the restrooms were clean. Rachel didn't remember this specific rest stop from her previous trips along I-7, but there were dozens of these small roadside facilities scattered across Kansas, and they all looked pretty much the same. Facilities, a couple of vending machines, a couple of picnic tables strewn across a little patch of grass, and, most importantly for Rachel, a coffee vending machine that appeared to work. When she pulled into the parking lot, she saw that the only other cars there were a minivan with Nebraska plates and an old pickup truck. She parked close to the building and went inside to use the restroom and get her coffee, which was not out of the ordinary for a weekday afternoon in the middle of nowhere. The rest stop's interior was clean and well maintained, with that institutional smell of old coffee and industrial cleaning products that define these establishments. When Rachel was ready to leave, she walked back to her car and noticed something strange. The pickup truck and minivan that had been there when she arrived were gone, that there were now vending machines that looked fully stocked and in working order, and she used the facilities, bought a coffee and a bag of chips, and spent about 15 minutes walking around the small building, stretching her legs and checking her phone messages, a sedan, an SUV, and two automobiles that she didn't recognize were in the parking lot. This wasn't very odd, because people were constantly coming and going for rest stops, but something about the scene felt unusual, and she couldn't quite place her finger on it. The rest stop was set up so that it was hard to tell which direction would take her west toward Denver, and which would lead back to eastbound I-7. So Rachel got back in her car and started the engine, but as she was about to leave, she realized she couldn't remember which direction she had been traveling when she pulled off the highway. She drove toward what she believed to be the eastbound on-ramp, thinking she could always turn around if she was mistaken. But something made her stomach drop when she arrived at the highway entrance. The sun was obscured by thick clouds, making it impossible for her to use it for navigation, and her GPS unit was having problems obtaining a satellite signal. Rachel drove back to the rest stop parking lot and tried the other exit. But this ramp also looked exactly like the one she remembered using to enter the rest stop. The concrete barriers, signage, and configuration were all the same, as if she had somehow returned to the starting point. She sat in her car, staring at the two highway entrances that seemed to be exact replicas of one another, feeling increasingly anxious. Nevertheless, she chose to try one of the ramps, going left and hoping it would lead her east toward Kansas City. The design, the signs, everything was the same. Rachel pulled over on the shoulder and attempted to calm herself after 10 minutes of driving along what looked to be Interstate 70 and seeing a familiar sign ahead, rest area, 2 miles. This was the same rest stop she had just left. Perhaps she decided to try driving in the opposite direction, west for about 15 minutes, before she saw another rest area sign. Her heart sank when she realized it was the same facility again, and she pulled back into the rest stop parking lot. She was more exhausted than she had anticipated, or perhaps the stress of her grandmother's death was impairing her judgment. Really scared, her GPS was still broken. Her cell phone showed no signal at all. The parking lot now had a motorcycle, a big RV, and a few cars she had never seen before, and she had driven almost 30 miles, according to the odometer on her car, but she kept coming to the same spot. However, as she entered the rest stop facility, everything was the same as before. The layout, the vending machines, the institutional odor, with the exception of the individuals present. An elderly man was seated at one of the tiny and middle-aged woman stood by the vending machines, repeatedly pressing the buttons without depositing any money. A younger man wearing a baseball cap sat in one of the chairs with a cell phone, seemingly waiting for something, even though the screen was dark. Rachel walked up to the tables, looking vacantly out the window. "I've been trying to get to Omaha for I don't know how long," he muttered, looking at her with drab, unfocused eyes, before asking an elderly man if he knew which way headed to Kansas City. "All roads return to this point. Same here," replied the woman by the vending machines as she turned around. "I was visiting my daughter in Colorado Springs. Arrived here on Tuesday and Wednesday." "Which day is it now?" A shiver went down Rachel's back. She stated, "It's Thursday." The man with the baseball cap looked up from his dead phone and said, "Thursday afternoon." "That's what I thought yesterday," he said. "And the day before that?" "It seems like time isn't working here." With her heart racing, Rachel retreated toward the exit. This couldn't be real. She was obviously having some kind of breakdown. Or maybe she had fallen asleep while driving and was having a vivid nightmare. But as she walked, her car was parked where she had left it, and the parking lot outside was just as she had left it. She returned to her Honda and attempted another strategy. In an attempt to find another road, or at least to go far enough away from the rest stop to regain her sense of direction, she drove directly across the parking lot and onto the prairie rather than using one of the highway on-ramps. However, after about 5 minutes of driving across the grassland, her car topped a slight rise, and she found herself staring down at the same rest area she had just left. There was no way, somehow, she had returned to the structure after driving away from it in a straight route. She made numerous more attempts at this, traveling across the plains in various directions, but she always ended up back at the rest pause, no matter which way you tried to travel. It seemed as though the building was in the center of an invisible vortex that pulled everything back to it. The sun had already set, but Rachel was unable to determine whether it was the same day or if she had lost time. The rest stop building's fluorescent lights were giving the parking lot an unsettling glow as the sky grew darker. A lot, in the hopes that everything would make sense in the morning, she made the decision to spend the night in her car. However, the sun was in the same spot in the sky when she woke up it had been when she had first arrived at the rest stop. The time in her automobile was still 2:30 p.m., despite the fact that she was positive she had spent hours there. Once more, the faces of the persons inside the structure were different, yet they all had the same blank, perplexed looks. None of them could provide her with a direct response when she asked them how long they had been there. It felt as though time had no purpose. Here, Rachel drove in all directions, tried several roads, and even tried to leave on foot over what seemed like several days of trying to get out of the rest stop. But no matter what she did, she kept returning to the same building, the same parking lot, the same vending machines, and the same awful feeling that she was stuck in a loop, seeing other travelers arriving who were equally disoriented and perplexed as she had been, was the hardest part. After parking in the lot and using the facilities, they would find they were unable to leave. A few of them appeared to resignedly accept their circumstances. Rachel and other people continued to look for a way out. She noticed that others who had been there longer seemed to fade in some way, growing more ethereal and less distinct every day. The old man who had been attempting to reach Omaha was now hardly more than a blurry picture. She questioned whether she was also beginning to wane. Following that, one morning, or what was deemed to be a morning in that timeless location, Rachel noticed a change when she woke up. Her GPS device was operational once more, pinpointing her precise location on Kansas Interstate 70. There was a signal on her cell phone. It was 2:45 p.m. on her dashboard clock. Within 15 minutes following her initial arrival at the rest station, she turned on the ignition and headed for what she hoped was the Eastern Freeway. This time, the route headed east toward Kansas City, rather than back to the rest station. She spent 30 hours driving, minutes without turning around for fear that she might be dragged back into the trap of the rest stop if she did. Rachel sought to report what had transpired at the police station as soon as she arrived in Kansas City that evening. Although courteous, the cops were obviously dubious about her account. They hypothesized that she may have had a medical episode of some sort, perhaps triggered by stress and exhaustion. Over the years, Rachel made the trek from Denver to Kansas City multiple times, but she never discovered the rest stop again. Despite searching maps and satellite photos, she was unable to find any rest areas that fit her recollection of the location. It seemed to have never been there. However, occasionally, late at night, she gets calls from unknown numbers. As she responds, she hears people pleading for assistance, claiming to be lost and unable to find their way home. It sounds as though the voices are calling from a great distance because they are hollow and distant. Rachel always ends calls right away, but she can't get rid of the impression that those people who are still stuck at the rest stop and are attempting to break free from that never-ending cycle of time and space are calling. Thousands of people use the rest areas along Interstate 70 every day without any problems, making it one of the most trafficked highways in the United States. However, passengers sometimes claim to become lost at some facilities, losing sight of time, or had trouble navigating back to the highway. However, for Rachel Davis and possibly other people who have never returned home, there are locations along America's roadways where time passes differently, reality doesn't apply, and passengers can become disoriented in directions unrelated to incorrect turns or malfunctioning GPS devices. Although she still occasionally drives between Denver and Kansas City, she now always makes sure her gas tank is full before heading out into the vast emptiness of the Kansas prairie and never stops at rest sites she is unfamiliar with, because that rest stop is still waiting for the next bewildered motorist to come into its parking lot. Assuming they are merely taking a brief respite from the road, somewhere out there, in the area between here and there. 7. The Shadow Valley. Motel Kevin and Amy Richardson were on their way to Sedona, Arizona, for their honeymoon in October 2002. They're getting married in Phoenix, when an unplanned breakdown forced them to spend the night at a secluded motel that seemed to live outside of time and reality. What should have been a romantic 3-hour drive through the desert turned into a terrifying ordeal. For their honeymoon, the couple had leased a convertible, a red Mustang that Kevin believed would be ideal for speeding through the picturesque desert roadways of Arizona. They departed Phoenix at approximately 4:00 p.m., intending to get in Sedona for supper at a posh restaurant that Amy had reserved months in advance. They traveled north on Interstate 17, passing through some of the southwestern desert's most breathtaking scenery. They were driving through Black Canyon City, a small town, when the Mustang started making odd noises about an hour into the trip. Kevin saw the temperature gauge moving closer to the red zone as the engine began to run rough. In search of a petrol station where someone could inspect the vehicle. He turned off at the next exit. The exit opened into a two-lane highway that extended into the desert, where there were no buildings or other indications of human habitation. After 10 minutes or so of slow driving with the engine still overheating, Kevin saw a sign that said, Shadow Valley Motel, 5 meters, clean rooms, reasonable rates. Amy looked over their route atlas and stated, I've never heard of Shadow Valley. Kevin was more worried about the car than the geography, saying, It's not on any of these maps. Steam was starting to emerge from beneath the hood, and the engine was now making frightening knocking noises. We need to stop somewhere before this thing completely dies on us, he stated. They discovered the Shadow Valley Motel 5 miles down the desert highway. It was a tiny L-shaped structure with roughly 12 rooms that had been painted white, but had been worn down by years of wind and sun in the desert. Next to the motel was a small diner and what looked like a service station, though the gas pumps looked like they hadn't been updated since the 1970s. The parking lot was cracked asphalt with weeds growing through the cracks, and a flickering neon sign advertised vacancy in pink letters. The sudden silence was unnerving. Kevin pulled the smoking Mustang into the motel parking lot and turned off the engine. The motel office was a tiny room with wood-paneled walls and a counter that appeared to have been there for decades. Behind the counter sat an elderly man with deeply tanned skin and eyes that seemed much older than his face. There were no aircraft overhead, no traffic noises, only the tick of the cooling engine and the whisper of desert wind. He had a bolo tie and a faded western shirt, and his teeth were yellow from smoking cigarettes for years. Car trouble? He inquired in a growly voice, despite Kevin hadn't stated anything about their breakdown. Yeah, the engine, Kevin said. Is there somewhere near here where we can have it checked out? It's overheated. My nephew Eddie, who owns the garage, will check it out first thing in the morning, the elderly man said, nodding toward the service station next door. Kevin looked at Amy, who grudgingly concurred. You folks need a room for the night. They really didn't have much choice, Kevin said, because they were stuck in the middle of nowhere with a broken down car and no cell phone service. How much? For a room, the old man said. $40, cash only. Room 7 is quiet, away from the noise of the highway. Kevin paid the $40 and was given an antique metal key or a plastic diamond-shaped tag. Amy sat on the edge of the bed and looked around the room with obvious discomfort. Room 7, which was at the far end of the motel and faced the desert instead of the parking lot, was clean but outdated, with a double bed covered in a faded floral bedspread, a small TV that looked like it was from the 1980s, and a window air conditioner that rattled loudly when Kevin turned it on. There is something about this place that makes me uneasy, she remarked. After checking his watch, Kevin saw that it was beyond 6 p.m. and he tried his cell phone again, but there was still no service. Let's just get through the night, he said. We'll get the car fixed tomorrow and continue to Sedona. They had missed their dinner reservation in Sedona. A covered walkway connected the motel's diner to the main structure, where they chose to have dinner. The diner was bigger than it had looked from the outside, with red vinyl booths and a long counter with chrome stalls, a few other patrons seated around the room, a middle-aged woman sitting alone at the counter, staring into her coffee cup, an elderly couple sharing a piece of pie, and a truck driver reading a newspaper. The waitress was a slender woman in her 50s with bleached blonde hair and weary eyes. Dolores replied, "You folks just checking in," as she placed them in a booth near the window. "Yeah, car broke down," Kevin responded. She was wearing a pink uniform with Dolores embroidered on the pocket, and she moved with the tired efficiency of someone who had been doing the same work for decades. The lunch was unexpectedly wonderful, with classic American diner fare made expertly and delivered hot, but as they remarked, "We're hoping to get it fixed tomorrow." Dolores gave them an almost compassionate look, adding, "Eddie's real good with cars. He'll get you fixed up and back on the road The truck driver hadn't turned a page of his newspaper in the 30 minutes they had been there. The elderly couple sat still over their shared pie. The woman at the counter kept staring into her coffee cup if she were in a trance, and Kevin and Amy both started to feel more and more uneasy as they ate. The total lack of typical diner noises, no coffee pot gurgling, no cash register beeping, no sizzling from the kitchen, was even more unnerving. The only sounds were Dolores's gentle footsteps as she went from table to table and Kevin and Amy's muffled conversations. After they had finished their meal and Kevin went to pay the check, he noticed something odd about the other patrons. Back in their room, Amy locked the door right away and pushed the little dresser in front of it, and they looked somehow faded in the dim diner lighting, like old photographs that had been in the sun too long, their edges blurred, and when he looked at them directly, they seemed less solid than they should have been. As they got ready for bed, Kevin kept hearing noises outside their room, footsteps on the walkway, doors opening and closing, muffled voices. But when he looked out the window, the motel parking lot was empty except for their broken-down Mustang. "I don't care if you think I'm being paranoid," she said, adding, "Something is very wrong with this place." At around midnight, Amy shook Kevin's shoulder and said, "Listen," and they heard what sounded like a party big band jazz from someplace in the motel, from the 1940s, and the sound of conversation and laughter, which seemed to be coming from multiple rooms away, but was distinct enough that they could hear individual voices. Kevin dressed and went outside to investigate, and while the music and laughter were undoubtedly coming from inside the motel, as he moved along the covered walkway, each room I attempted phoning the front desk, but Amy was sitting on the bed with the phone in her hand when he got back to their room, which seemed dark and empty, and the sounds seemed to move as he walked, always staying just ahead of him, just out of reach. "The phone is dead," she said. Not even a dial tone. The party sounds persisted until just before dawn, when they abruptly ceased, leaving the motel in total stillness. They took turns remaining awake and keeping an eye on the door for the remainder of the night. In the morning, Kevin went to the service station to discuss their car with Eddie. The garage was a single bay with tools and car parts strewn about, but there was no sign of the mechanic. After waiting for roughly 20 minutes, Kevin went back to the motel office to inquire about Eddie. "Eddie," he said, as the elderly man behind the counter gave him a perplexed look. "Eddie is not present. It has never been. However, you mentioned that your nephew Eddie operated the garage yesterday night," Kevin remarked, and the elderly guy gave a slow shake of his head. "Son, you must be considering another location. Years have passed since that garage was shut down." A shiver went down Kevin's back. The clerk appeared to have forgotten the chat, but he was positive the customer had brought up Eddie the previous evening. He went back to the room and explained the situation to Amy. Even though the Mustang's engine was broken, they made the decision to try starting it and see if they could make it back to the main highway. However, the car started right away and operated flawlessly when Kevin turned the key. There was no indication of the overheating issue that had left them stuck the previous evening, and the temperature gauge read normal. They packed their luggage and left the motel. Amy glanced in the side mirror at the Shadow Valley motel as they drove off. "Kevin," she murmured, her voice wavering. "Look." He looked at something that made his palms itch in the rearview mirror. The steering wheel trembles. In the heat of the desert, the motel was disappearing, turning into a translucent mirage. The building vanished entirely in a matter of seconds, leaving behind nothing but barren desert. Without stopping, they drove all the way back to Interstate 17 and on to Sedona. Kevin asked the concierge about the Shadow Valley motel as soon as they got to their motel. Despite having spent his entire life in the neighborhood, the man had never heard of a motel with such name. Amy later studied the history of the neighborhood where they had stayed overnight at the local library. What she discovered helped them both appreciate how fortunate they were to have departed at that time. Along that section of route, the desert, Rose, a modest motel and dining establishment, had been opened since 1962. All 14 visitors and employees had inexplicably vanished one October evening. In the parking lot, their vehicles were discovered. There were no indications of fighting or violence, and their possessions remained in their rooms. They had just disappeared. The FBI and local police also looked into the motel, but they were never able to locate the missing individuals. In the 1970s, the property was abandoned and subsequently razed. Amy discovered newspaper stories that said the location had been deserted and abandoned ever since. Knowing that people would assume they were lying or having hallucinations, Kevin and Amy never discussed their encounter at the Shadow Valley Motel in public. However, they retained the motel ticket and the room 7 key as evidence that it had indeed occurred. Sometimes, years later, they get stories from other tourists who say they stayed at a motel that sounds just like the Shadow Valley. These people spoke of the same old desk clerk, the same faded dining patrons, and the same nighttime party noises. Most unsettling of all, a number of these passengers claim that they were never able to locate the motel when they attempted to return to look into it. With no structures or amenities 4 miles in either direction, the highway segment where Kevin and Amy broke down is still a barren area of the Arizona desert. Satellite photos reveal nothing but sand, rock, and sporadic desert plants, and state highway officials have no records of any motel ever functioning in that region. Drivers on that desolate highway, however, occasionally report seeing lights in the distance late at night where none should be, and sometimes tourists who are having problems with their cars say they have discovered assistance at a little motel that shows up when they disappear once they're back on the road, just when they need it most. For Kevin and Amy Richardson, their honeymoon served as a reminder that there are locations in the American Southwest where the usual doesn't hold true, where history doesn't want to be forgotten, and where visitors can find themselves in time capsules that exist outside of our familiar world. They were lucky to have escaped with only a story they can never fully comprehend and memories. Maybe others weren't that fortunate, ate the wrong turn on Route 18 before beginning their senior year. Chris Murphy, Tyler Brooks, and Hannah West, 3 Portland, Maine, high school classmates, made the decision to take a summer road trip to explore the isolated northern New Hampshire backcountry, July 2007. What started off as a journey through the when they took what appeared to be a harmless detour and ended themselves in a location that shouldn't be on any map. The White Mountains turned into a nightmare. In order to rent a Jeep Cherokee that could handle the rugged logging roads and mountain trails they wished to explore, the 3 of them had been accumulating money from their summer jobs 4 months. Chris, who saw himself as a master navigator, had mapped out a path across some of New England's most remote wilderness areas after studying topographic maps of the area. On a Thursday morning in mid-July, they drove west en route to into the mountains, leaving Portland behind. They intended to camp and hike in the national forest for 4 days, following trails that few visitors ever found and old logging roads. Being seasoned hikers, the 3 were certain they could manage everything was thrown at them by the wilderness. The initial 2 days proceeded flawlessly. They climbed to waterfalls tucked away in the forest, tented close to immaculate alpine lakes, and relished the kind of seclusion that is impossible to get in more populous places. Saturday afternoon, they were traveling down a small rural road. On their map, a road known as Route 18 was shown as a picturesque path that would eventually lead them back to the main highway system. Winding through dense woodland with precipitous drop-offs on one side and towering pine trees on the other, Route 18 was just wide enough for 1 car. After an hour or so of following it, they reached a fork in the road that none of their maps indicated. A tiny track split off to the right, ascending up into the mountains, while the main route appeared to turn left and downhill. Tyler and Hannah waited in the Jeep as Chris looked over the maps. saying, "This fork isn't shown on any of these." He laid 3 maps across the car's hood. In light of this, Route 18 should just keep going straight. Tyler was drawn to the right-hand track, which vanished into the forest and promised to provide more adventure. But Anna recommended that they take the left fork, which appeared to be the more well-traveled route. "Come on," he urged. "We have plenty of time and 4-wheel drive. Let's see its progress." Chris folded up the maps, and Hannah, against her better judgment, agreed. Driving carefully up a steep, rocky trail that wound deeper into the mountains, they picked the right branch, with huge pine trees obstructing the majority of the afternoon sunshine. The surrounding woodland became denser and darker. After a few minutes of cautious driving, they came to the top of a ridge and were able to glimpse a valley that was entirely unlike anything they had ever seen in New Hampshire. The valley was lined with massive, ancient-looking trees that were almost tropical in their size and density, in contrast to the normal New England forest of mixed hardwoods and pines. A dozen individuals holding hands would have needed to encircle some of the enormous tree trunks. The quality of the light in the valley was more odd. The light coming through the canopy had a greenish aquatic aspect that made everything appear surreal and dreamy, even though it was still mid-afternoon. In addition, the air was much warmer and more humid than it should have been in New Hampshire at that altitude. "This is strange," Hannah remarked as they gradually descended into the valley. Chris was looking at his GPS unit, which had been operating well until they entered the valley. "These trees look like they're thousands of years old. I didn't know anything like this existed in New England." At this point, it displayed nothing but unresponsive, incapable of receiving a satellite signal. "We must be in some kind of dead zone," he stated. The track went on for another mile through the old woodland before emerging into a clearing where they discovered something that shocked the 3 companions into silence. These mountains can block GPS signals sometimes. The ruins of what seemed like a medieval town were in the middle of the clearing. There were peaked-roof stone buildings, cobblestone streets, and a center square with what appeared to be the remnants of a cathedral or church. However, this was not the remains of a former community. It looked like people lived in the buildings. From a number of chimneys, smoke rose. Clothing lines ran between dwellings, with clothing hanging to dry, while gardens developed in between. The homes, it appeared to be a thriving hamlet, but one that belonged in Europe centuries ago, than in the New Hampshire mountains. Tyler parked the Jeep along the edge of the road in 2007 clearing, and the 3 companions tried to comprehend what they were seeing while sitting in startled silence. It was an authentic village. They could smell wood smoke and cooking food, hear voices resonating over the clearing, and saw people moving between the buildings, but it was impossible. A medieval community could not possibly exist without being discovered in the wilderness of contemporary America. Several of the people saw their car and started to approach them while they watched. Women wore long gowns, men wore rough pants and shirts, and everyone else wore plain, old-fashioned attire in muted hues that appeared to have been handmade. As though they hadn't received much sunlight, their cheeks were emaciated and pale, and they with a peculiar shuffling gait that made Hannah think of sleepwalkers. It moved. An old man with sunken eyes and a long grey beard was the first local. To arrive at them, he walked over to Chris's side of the Jeep and spoke in hard-to-understand English with an accent. "Travellers," he uttered in a voice that resembled the rustle of dried leaves. Unsure of how to react, Chris partially rolled down his window and said, "You have found your way to our home. We do not see many visitors from the outside world." His words, "We're just passing through. We took a wrong turn and unintentionally arrived here," when the old guy smiled. His discolored and damaged teeth were visible. When he said, "There are no accidents. You must be hungry after your travel. Only those who are supposed to find us do so." Now, more locals had gathered around the Jeep. "Please accept our hospitality." All of them men, women, and children had hollow eyes and a pale, gaunt appearance. With looks that suggested they were hungry but not for food, they gazed at the three buddies. They seemed to be starving for something completely different. Tyler tried to start the engine, but nothing occurred. Hannah whispered to Tyler, "We need to leave now." The Jeep was dead. No radio, no lights, and no ignition response. He made multiple attempts, but the car would not start. Their situation appeared to please the elderly man. "Your machine has chosen to rest," he stated. "Maybe it understands that you need time to really appreciate what you've discovered here." The three companions looked at one another in fear. "Come, let us show you our village. We have much to share with visitors from your world." They were surrounded by people who didn't seem normal, and they were stuck in an impossible place. Chris made up his mind quickly. When he tried to turn on the ignition again, the engine turned over. "Thank you for the invitation," he said to the elderly guy, "but we really need to get back on the road. Our families are expecting us right away." Tyler pushed the Jeep into reverse and withdrew away from the crowd without waiting for the villagers to respond. He then whirled around and drove as fast as he dared back toward the trail they had taken into the valley. The three of them turned back as they emerged from the unfamiliar jungle and saw the locals watching them go from the clearing. However, the most unsettling aspect was that several of even as Tyler drove the Jeep to 40 Papi on the tough terrain, the people appeared to be following them, sprinting through the trees beside the trail at an inconceivable rate. They paused to gather their breath when they arrived at the ridge where they had first spotted the valley. In hindsight, the valley seemed entirely normal, a regular New Hampshire woodland devoid of the ancient trees and the enigmatic village. The whole incident seemed to have been a collective hallucination. However, Chris saw something that chilled him to the bone. His watch indicated that they had been in the valley for around 2 hours, yet the sun was still precisely where it had been when they had first arrived. Not a moment had gone by. They returned by car to this time. They chose the left branch of the fork in the road, which brought them back to their familiar surroundings after about an hour. None of them had a good night's sleep in the campground close to North Conway, where they stayed that night. They could hear noises in the jungle all the time. They heard footsteps circling their tent, voices beckoning, and what sounded like the old man's voice speaking just out of earshot. They shortened their trip by 2 days when they packed up and drove directly back to Portland the following morning. Despite their best efforts, they were unable to locate any historical records of any habitation in the area where they had discovered the village. Official sources described the valley they had drove through as wilderness that had never been populated or developed. Chris made contact with the Historical Society of New Hampshire and explained what no medieval settlement had ever existed anywhere in the state. According to the researcher he spoke with, despite what they had witnessed, although she was unable to explain how an event of that nature could occur in the middle of the forest without licenses or advertising, she speculated that they might have discovered a Renaissance fair or historical reenactment. The three friends spent the next few months trying to persuade themselves that they had fallen victim to some sort of mass illusion, perhaps brought on by stress, altitude, or tainted water. However, they were unable to explain the tangible proof. The old woodland and the stone structures were plainly visible in the pictures Hannah had taken with her digital camera. The pictures were unquestionably real. The dreams that started soon after they returned to Maine were more unsettling. The same recurrent nightmare began to plague all three of them. They had returned to the medieval village, but they were unable to leave this time. They were besieged by the villagers, who begged them to stay forever with pallid hands. They could sense how they were changing into the peasants in their dreams, pale, hollow-eyed, and craving an unidentified food. Physical changes were first noticed by Tyler. His skin turned nearly translucent as it started to lose its pigment. He complained of feeling cold all the time, even in the middle of summer, and lost weight quickly. Like the people they had met, black rings formed in his eyes, giving him a sunken appearance. Within weeks, Chris and Hannah displayed comparable symptoms. Each of the three grew all reclusive and antisocial, favoring solitude above socializing with loved ones. They complained and stopped eating their usual meals. The ash was the flavor of everything. Raw meat, ideally still warm, was the only thing that seemed to satiate their odd desire. All three had left school and were living as recluses by October, despite their families' efforts to obtain them medical attention. Doctors were unable to identify any physical issues. The results of psychological testing, brain scans, and blood tests were all normal. In November 2007, Chris, Tyler, and Hannah left notes for their families stating that they were returning to New Hampshire to complete the task they had begun. This was the last time anyone heard from them. At the same fork in the road where they had taken their disastrous detour, their Jeep was discovered abandoned on Route 18. After weeks of searching, search and rescue crews were unable to locate the three companions. Aerial inspections revealed no clearings or buildings anywhere in the area they had described, and the trail they claimed to have taken into the valley was nowhere to be found. Hannah West, Tyler Brooks, and Chris Murphy are still listed as missing, although local rangers and in the White Mountains, hikers occasionally claim to have seen three pale individuals moving through the forest at dusk, always going more into the woods, always looking for something they can never discover. New Hampshire's mountains are still traversed via Route 18, which hundreds of cars and hikers utilize each year without any problems. However, sometimes, tourists report discovering unmarked paths that aren't included on any maps, and some say they've even caught a sight of old woodlands and improbable settlements tucked away in unnatural valleys. These reports are a warning to anyone who are familiar with the tale of the three main friends. There are certain bad turns that lead to places you can't go back from. Furthermore, once a hunger is awoken, it may never be satiated. There are many mysteries in the New England wilderness, and not all of them are intended for the contemporary world to uncover. 9 Hitchhiker of Highway 375 in September 2008. Jessica Collins, a sophomore at the University of Washington, was traveling alone from her hometown of Spokane, Washington to Seattle to begin her junior year. She had taken the 4-hour drive along Interstate 90 many times before, but this time would be different. What her car radio's usual background noise would turn into a scary encounter that made her wonder about the nature of reality itself. About 3:00 p.m., Jessica had left Spokane, hoping to get to Seattle before the evening rush hour had made the city's gridlock intolerable on her Sunday afternoon. She was behind the wheel of her trustworthy Honda Civic, filled with textbooks and clothing for the upcoming semester. It was the ideal driving weather. The trip into the high desert land of Washington was especially picturesque due to the clear skies and pleasant temperatures. Jessica chose to listen to some music on the radio to kill time around an hour into her drive as she was traveling through the isolated region between Spokane and Moses Lake. The scenery outside was monotonously lovely. The landscape is dotted with brown grass and undulating hills, punctuated by farmhouses and grain elevators. In search of something positive to keep her awake during the lengthy drive, she began to browse the radio stations, as was typical in this thinly inhabited area. The majority of the frequencies picked up weak or static signals from distant cities. However, she started to hear snippets of conversations that didn't seem like typical radio programs as she changed the dial. She initially believed she was listening to truckers' CB radio talk, perhaps farm workers' radio conversations. Although the voices were distinct, they appeared to be engaged in routine discussions about commonplace subjects, such as the weather, identifying specific individuals, and local events and activities. However, as Jessica kept listening, she started to feel uneasy about these discussions. She was the topic of conversation on the radio. The voice of a lady stated, "She's driving the blue Honda," over the static. She appears to be by herself. Jessica turned up the volume right away and stopped on the highway's shoulder. With her car's engine running, she sat there listening to the radio. She heard nothing but static for a few minutes. The voices then came back. She paused. The voice of a man spoke. Now she's paying attention. She's aware that we can see her. Jessica clutched the steering wheel, her hands trembling. This had to be a coincidence of some sort. Perhaps that there were people discussing another motorist. On the freeway, however, when the woman's voice returned, Jessica's blood ran cold at what she said. The license plate of Jessica Collins is 247 RMG. She stopped on the southbound shoulder, around 20 meters east of Moses Lake. Jessica hastily glanced around, looking for any indication of who might be observing her. There were no other cars in sight, and the highway was vacant in both directions. There were no structures, radio towers, or other visible locations where someone could be watching her and broadcasting where she was. There was no reception when she reached for her cell phone to dial 911. This wasn't uncommon in the isolated parts of eastern Washington, but the time further heightened her suspicions. Eager to go to a more populous region, she shifted into drive and re-entered the highway, driving more quickly now. As she drove, the radio commentators carried on with their commentary. The man said, "She's moving again, about 75 meters per hour. She appears frightened." "Good," said the woman. "She ought to be afraid. She has been traveling this path for the past 3 years. Each semester at the same time, we've had our eye on her." Jessica totally shut off the radio, yet the sounds persisted. Despite the lack of electricity, they appeared to be coming from the speakers. She attempted to switch channels, but the same discussion about her actions and demeanor was aired on all frequencies. The voices grew more intimate and specific as she got closer to Moses Lake. Observations. The woman remarked, "She's wearing that blue sweater her grandmother gave her." Jessica stared down at her sweater in disbelief. "The one she always wears when she's nervous about starting a new school year. Even if it was blue and had been a gift from her grandma, strangers couldn't possibly know that about her life." The man went on to say that her psychology textbooks were in the back seat. "She's concerned about the class taught by Professor Martinez. I've heard it's very challenging. This was not feasible." Only 2 weeks prior, Jessica had signed up for Professor Martinez's abnormal psychology course, and she hadn't discussed her worries about the class's difficulties with anybody outside of her academic advisor. Nothing a stranger could possibly know about her was known by the voices. They talked about her early years in Spokane, her connection with her parents, her post-graduation goals, and even her personal concerns and thoughts that she had never talked about before. Jessica thought about stopping at the police station to report the incident as she was driving through Moses Lake. But how could she explain the voices discussing her on her radio? They would believe that she was experiencing a mental collapse. Rather, she made the decision to keep driving in the hopes that the odd radio occurrence would end when she approached Seattle. However, the voices grew darker in tone as the miles went by. The woman uttered the words, "She thinks she can escape by reaching Seattle with humor. She doesn't understand that we're not limited by geography." "Tell her about the accident," said the man. "What accident?" Jessica exclaimed, then instantly felt bad about saying it. Whatever was going on, she didn't want to support it. The woman's voice became icy and purposeful. "About 15 miles ahead, Jessica, there is a curve in the road that will cause your accident. You're going to move too quickly." Jessica instantly slowed down, lowering her velocity to 55 p.m. anxiously. She started scanning the horizon for any potentially hazardous turns. The man claimed it wouldn't help to slow down. "It's about the deer, not about speed." "Which deer?" Jessica muttered, even though she was aware that she shouldn't be talking to the voices. The woman clarified that it was the doe that would run into the road. "You will lose control of your vehicle, swerve to avoid it, and roll down the embankment." Your neck will be broken quickly by the impact. This time, Jessica stopped at a rest spot close to George Washington. She shut off the engine entirely and sat quietly, attempting to collect herself and consider the situation logically. Perhaps she was experiencing a hallucination brought on by stress. Perhaps her mental state was being affected by the loneliness of the long drive. However, the voices persisted when she switched the radio back on. They sounded impatient now. She's stopped again, the man said. The woman added, "We're real, Jessica," addressing her directly. She's trying to figure out if we're real or if she's going crazy. We're more real than you can comprehend. Then tell me how, Jessica shouted out loud, dropping any pretense that this wasn't happening in an attempt to assist you prevent the accident. Don't take the highway, the woman had said. It's longer but safer to travel through Vantage via the back roads. An alternate route that would take her north through the tiny hamlet of Vantage and then across the Columbia River to connect with Interstate 90 farther west was discovered by Jessica as she read her road atlas. Her travel would take an additional hour or more, but the detour was worth it if it meant avoiding whatever it was the voices were warning her about. The radio voices persisted in their comments as she traveled the winding roads in the direction of Vantage, but there the tone had shifted. They suddenly gave off an almost kind, protecting vibe. "Nice decision," the man said. At mile marker 143, the deer would have been visible. At 6:47 p.m., you would have passed away. The woman said regretfully, "We've witnessed it happen so many times. The curve, the deer, and the outcome are always the same, regardless of the drivers and dates." Jessica was worried that the answers would be more upsetting than the questions, so she refrained from asking them who they were and how they knew these things. She followed the Columbia River over picturesque rural lanes on the detour through Vantage. The radio voices grew softer and fewer in number as the sun started to drop, illuminating the desert landscape in vivid oranges and reds. The woman told Jessica, "You're safe now," as she got closer to the bridge at Vantage. "The danger has passed. Who are you?" inquired Jessica at last. After a long silence, the man said, "How do you know all these things about me?" It was US who failed to make it. "It's simple," he said. "The ones without anyone to warn them, who sped up that curve, and who failed to spot the deer in time." Adding, "We try to help when we can." The woman continued, "However, the majority of individuals believe they are dreaming things and don't pay attention to voices on the radio." The noises grew progressively softer and farther away as Jessica traveled across the Columbia River Bridge. She felt silly, but she called out to the radio, "Thank you, drive carefully, Jessica," was the halting response. Additionally, keep in mind that occasionally the voices you hear are attempting to save your life. By the time she arrived at the Seattle suburbs, the radio was just transmitting standard channels, music, news, and traffic updates. After the enigmatic voices vanished, Jessica began to question whether the whole ordeal had been a complex hallucination triggered by loneliness and stress. However, she looked up the Washington State Patrol traffic reports online the following morning. 6:47 p.m. A deadly collision had occurred near mile marker 143 on Interstate 90 the night before, precisely as the voices had foreseen. One car lost control and crashed down an embankment after swerving to escape a deer. The driver, an Oregon traveling salesman, had suffered a shattered neck and died quickly. Jessica never again drove that section of Interstate 90 by herself. She always kept her radio on in case the voices needed to alert her to something new, and she always took the longer route through Vantage when she had to travel between Seattle and Spokane. Over the years, she received sporadic reports from other truckers who had encountered similar occurrences on isolated Pacific Northwest roadways. They would talk about hearing voices on their radios warning them of impending accidents, bad weather, or hazardous driving conditions. The majority of people brushed these tales aside as urban legends or the result of hyperactive fantasies. Jessica, however, was wiser. She realized that some radio voices aren't coming from transmitters or stations, but rather from people who are concerned enough about strangers to cross the line between life and death to warn of impending danger. With thousands of cars passing daily between Seattle and the eastern portion of the state, Interstate 90 remains one of the most regularly used roads in Washington state. The majority of drivers go without any problems, passing the time by listening to music or talk radio. However, on occasion, on the most isolated sections of the highway, drivers claim to hear voices on their radios that appear to know who they are and where they are headed. These voices occasionally issue alerts regarding weather hazards or road conditions, and occasionally, for those who are fortunate enough to hear and believe, these voices offer information that has the potential to be life or death. The event on Interstate 90 fundamentally altered Jessica Collins' perspective on the world. She's currently a psychologist in practice in Seattle. She discovered that sometimes the most significant signals originate from the most unlikely sources, and that there are communication channels that are beyond our typical comprehension. She continues to drive with her radio turned on, constantly listening for voices that might have something significant to say while sifting through the static. Because often the most important information comes through the quietest channels from people who have already paid the ultimate price to learn what they're attempting to share. In a world full of noise and distraction, the town that is backward Robert Chen, an insurance salesman, took what seemed to be a straightforward diversion to escape construction gridlock on Interstate 94 in April 2009 while traveling from Chicago to Milwaukee for a client meeting. On that trip, he found himself in a small Wisconsin hamlet where, although everything appeared regular at first, a closer look showed that reality itself was in reverse. Robert had traveled to Milwaukee from Chicago. Throughout his 15-year career, he drove hundreds of times and was familiar with every mile of the road. However, traffic was backed up 4 miles on this Tuesday morning due to extensive work in Kenosha. A different route along Highway 50, a two-lane road that would pass through rural Wisconsin farm area, was recommended by his GPS. It would only take him around half an hour more to get there. On the diversion, he saw the usual Midwest landscape, little trees, rolling farmland with red barns and silos, and the occasional creek meandering through pastures where cattle were contentedly grazing. After months of racing over congested interstates, Robert found himself relishing the slower speed and picturesque surroundings on this lovely spring morning. He noticed a road sign that said, "Welcome to Millbrook, population 847." Some 40 minutes into the detour, Millbrook was founded in 1892. Its downtown area consisted of a single main street lined with well-maintained buildings that looked like they were from the early 1900s, and the town wasn't marked on his GPS. But that wasn't unusual for small rural communities that might not be included in older mapping databases. Millbrook seemed like a charming little town that time had forgotten. There was a barber shop with the classic red and white striped pole, a general store with a wooden porch and rocking chairs, a small diner with checkered curtains in the windows, and other establishments that gave the town a nostalgic Norman Rockwell feel. Robert was immediately struck by how clean and immaculate everything appeared. There was no graffiti, no litter, and no evidence of the urban decay that beset even the most pleasant small towns. As he drove slowly down Main Street, Robert saw people going about their daily lives, walking along the sidewalks, entering and leaving shops, and conversing with neighbors. The storefronts were freshly painted, the sidewalks were swept clean, and flower boxes hung from lampposts were filled with blooming petunias and marigolds. Everyone was dressed conservatively, and neatly in the scene was serene and pleasant, the kind of small-town atmosphere that made him yearn for a simpler way of life. But as he continued through town, Robert started to notice small details that seemed strange. For example, a man walking his dog seemed to be moving backwards, but his face was turned forward and he seemed to be looking where he was going. The styles were a little outdated, but not particularly so. Robert initially brushed these observations aside as illusions or fleeting moments in which he misinterpreted what he was witnessing, but as he paused at the town's single laundry, he noticed that a woman was removing clothes from a clothesline and placing them in her basket, but the clothes were becoming more damp and wrinkled as she handled them, as if the drying process was reversing. Traffic light, which was red. He had more time to look around him, and what he saw made his skin crawl. An old man reading a newspaper on a bench was turning pages from back to front, and a group of kids playing in a small park across the street were playing what appeared to be a typical game of catch, except the ball was flying from their gloves to their hands rather than the other way around. Additionally, as Robert observed, the text on the pages that were visible appeared to be vanishing, leaving behind blank paper, and most unsettling of all was a woman pushing a stroller in front of her while pushing her infant, who seemed to be shrinking with every step, turning what had begun as a toddler-sized child into the child appeared to be getting smaller and smaller as Robert watched in horror. Aging backwards before his eyes, the traffic light changed to green, and Robert sped through the intersection as fast as he could without seeming to speed, wanting to leave Millbrook as soon as possible. But the town seemed to go on much longer than it should have given its apparent size. He passed a gas station where an attendant was using a gas pump in reverse rather than filling a car's tank, fuel flowing from the vehicle back into the underground storage tanks, the car's gas gauge moving backwards from full to empty, and block after block of the same well-maintained buildings and backwards moving people stretched ahead of him. At the local diner, Robert could see through the large windows that patrons were actively eating their meals, with food moving from their stomachs back onto their plates, becoming more fresh and appetizing as it reversed through the digestive process. The waitress was taking empty plates and filling them with food that appeared out of thin air, then placing them in front of customers who hadn't placed their orders yet. The customer appeared satisfied with this reverse transaction. Robert stopped in front of the diner, his hands shaking as he tried to comprehend what he was seeing. This couldn't be real. He must be experiencing some sort of hallucination, perhaps brought on by stress, sleep deprivation, or an unidentified medical condition. But when he checked his watch, he saw that his car's clock indicated that it was 9:47 a.m. Even though it had been 10:15 a.m., the second hand was spinning counterclockwise, and the digital clock on his dashboard was also running backwards, displaying older times with each second that went by. When he arrived in town, he attempted to start his car so he could go right away, but the engine refused to start. He tried multiple times without success, and then he discovered something that chilled him to the bone. A middle-aged man with a clean suit and tie tapped on his passenger side window, making him jump. His gas gauge was displaying less fuel than when he had entered the town, and it kept dropping as he watched, as if his car was using gasoline while it was sitting motionless with the engine off. Was standing next to the vehicle, grinning broadly and motioning for Robert to lower the window. "Have car problems," the man said as Robert opened the window a little. "Yeah, it won't start," Robert said, examining the man's face. "That happens sometimes to visitors," he said, adding that cars from the outside world don't always work properly here. At first glance, he appeared normal, but there was something wrong with his eyes, which seemed to be looking in multiple directions at once, as if they were seeing things that were happening in reverse chronological order. "When I'm ready to leave," Robert said. "I'm ready now." The man's smile grew wider, exposing teeth that appeared to be becoming whiter and cleaner as Robert watched, but he added, "Oh, but you haven't. We don't receive many visitors from your time. Most people never discover us, or if they do, they drive straight through without stopping to enjoy what they're seeing. Did you experience all Millbrook has to offer yet?" Robert inquired, unsure if he wanted to know the response. Time is moving as it should, the man said. Backwards toward simpler, better times when people understood their role in the world and life made sense. We're growing younger and wiser every day here in Millbrook, escaping all the hassles and complexities of the contemporary world. Now that he could see what the man meant, Robert turned to face the other people on the street. As he looked, it did appear like everyone in town was getting younger. The wrinkles were fading, the grey hair was getting darker. They were straightening their bent backs, however. There was something horrifying about the procedure, as though as they grew older, they were losing something vital. Robert inquired, "How long have you been here?" The man pondered for a while, his face growing puzzled. "I don't know how to respond to that. I've been becoming younger for what seems like years. But I'm not sure if that means I've been here 4 years, or if years have been taken away from me." "What happens when you get too young?" Robert said. "Time doesn't operate the same way here." Robert attempted to start his car again, and the man's smile wavered for the first time. "I don't know," he said. "No one talks about that. We just focus on enjoying the process of becoming our younger selves again. You could stay." The man yelled as Robert shifted the car into drive. "You could get younger, too." The man stepped back from the window, still grinning, but with a desperation and sadness in his reverse-moving eyes. "Return to your happier moments. Do you not wish to correct your errors? Relive the best times in your life?" Although he was tempted by the offer, who wouldn't want to go back in time to their youth in order to have another chance at life? Robert drove off without responding. However, Millbrook was fundamentally flawed. When he arrived at the edge of town, he noticed that Millbrook was disappearing, turning translucent and ghost-like, and within minutes, there was nothing behind him but empty farmland, as if the town had never existed at all. There was something about it that made him feel as though staying would mean losing himself in ways he couldn't quite comprehend. But according to his odometer, he had driven nearly 50 miles while in the town, which should have taken at least an hour on local roads. The clock abruptly jumped forward, showing 10:45 a.m., exactly 30 minutes after he had first seen the Welcome to Millbrook sign. Robert arrived in Milwaukee in time for his client meeting, but the experience left him deeply shaken. In the weeks that followed, Robert found himself thinking about the backwards town and the man's offer to stay and get younger. He attempted to look up Millbrook online, but was unable to find any records of any Wisconsin town with that name. Maps of the area showed only farmland and scattered rural communities, none of which matched what he had seen. He was dealing with the disappointments and constraints of middle age. His profession was demanding, his marriage was failing, and Chicago felt more and more stressful and pointless. He started using the same diversion route every time he traveled to Milwaukee in the hopes of finding Millbrook again. Months later, Robert quit his job and left Chicago, telling his wife he needed to find something more meaningful in life. He bought an RV and started traveling across the Midwest, searching for the town. But no matter how carefully he retraced his path, he was never able to find it, as if it existed in a pocket of reality that he could only access accidentally when he wasn't specifically looking for it. His former co-workers assumed he had suffered some sort of mental breakdown or midlife crisis, but Robert persisted in his search, driving back roads and rural highways, searching for clues that would lead him back to Millbrook. His wife filed for divorce after he had been absent for 6 months without regular contact. In a brief postcard written to his ex-wife from a small Iowa town, Robert Chen said, "I found another place where time moves backwards. The people here are getting younger every day. I think I'm ready to join them." That was the last time anyone heard from him. Investigators discovered his abandoned RV in a cornfield outside a town that, according to official records, had been abandoned since the 1950s, but local farmers claimed to have seen lights in the empty buildings at night and heard the sounds of people going about their daily lives in an area where no one else was. The postcard was dated 3 months prior to its mailing. Should have been. Highway 50 remains a popular alternative route between Chicago and Milwaukee. And while most drivers see nothing but ordinary farmland in Wisconsin, drivers sometimes claim seeing little settlements that aren't shown on any map. The temptation to stay can be strong for those who come across backwards places where people appear to be living life in reverse, getting younger instead of older, and undoing time, one day at a time. After all, who wouldn't want to go back in time to their best moments and undo their mistakes? However, as Robert Chen found that certain costs are unaffordable. For a second chance at life at least, time passes for a purpose. Additionally, attempting to change its flow could trap you in places where yesterday never ends and tomorrow never arrives.